All right, it's 1 minute after. So I think I'll kick it off here. So good afternoon, everybody, or good morning if you're joining us on Pacific time. And welcome everyone to our final webinar installment of our work on misinformation in Canada. But just before we get going, first we will begin by acknowledging the land we are delivering this session on today. So today I'm joining from Ottawa, which is located on the traditional unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. While we take a moment to acknowledge this, let's all recognize the history and continuation of colonialism on this land. And for all the settlers on this call to think about the benefits we experience because of colonialism and how we can do our best to respect and stand in solidarity with those who were here first. I know that many of you today are joining from different places. So we have shared a link to Native Land Digital with you here. Native Land Digital is a really cool not-for-profit, and they've created a map to show Indigenous territories, treaties, and languages. It's a really helpful tool for understanding more about the land we're on. And so I encourage you to take a minute to explore that later today or at a later date. So for those of you who I've perhaps never met, I'm Rachel Maxwell, the still very new Executive Director at Evidence for Democracy. I've officially been in the role for about 2 months now, and there's been so much to get up to speed on. This work on misinformation in particular has been really central to my onboarding, and I'm really excited to launch our full report today alongside this webinar. You'll all receive a link to that report as a follow-up from our session here today. And of course, it will be available on our website. So this research represents a year-long investigation into misinformation in Canada and how our context here, political and societal, really differs from other contexts. In many ways, this work is really exploratory as we became very aware that much more investigation and strategic research needs to be carried out to understand how misinformation impacts Canadians and its citizens. But one thing is certainly clear, which is that misinformation is a threat to our democracy. And from an E4D perspective, it really risks damaging that critical three-way relationship between science, society, and policy. So today, my colleague Tej here is going to walk us through the policy options that emerged from our research over the last year. If you attended the last webinar on this topic, you'll remember that Tej focused on what individuals can do to lessen the impact and spread of misinformation. So today we'll be looking at potential actions that can be taken on a larger scale by governments, because this really is an issue that will require both a bottom-up and top-down approach. Tej, just quickly, is our senior research associate who has been leading this work. He recently completed his PhD at the University of Toronto Scarborough in the Department of Physical and Environmental Sciences. He has a great interest in interdisciplinary work relevant to the science policy interface. So I couldn't think of a better person to have led this work over the last year, given how truly interdisciplinary the work itself is. And lastly, and finally, I just want to note that this work has been generously supported by the Government of Canada. And we've been really encouraged by the interest and support on this topic from you and our community. So thank you so much for your interest. It's really helped encourage our work and really solidified how important this topic is to our community. And finally, before I pass it over to Tej, just a couple housekeeping things. Please feel free to use the chat feature throughout. You can drop questions you have for us in there, or you can submit questions on the question and answer function. We'll be monitoring both, and there will be time for questions at the end, so we'll keep an eye on those. We do also, one other thing, we do have auto-generated captions turned on today, and if you would prefer to not have those showing up, you can turn them off by clicking the closed captioning button at the bottom of your screen and selecting hide subtitles. I think that's it from me. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Tej. Thank you.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for that intro, Rachel. It's really nice. So today we're going to be talking about policy options regarding misinformation, but I'm just going to do a brief recap of the definitions that might be important today. So essentially, misinformation refers to false or misleading information spread regardless of intent. A subcategory of this is disinformation. Disinformation is misinformation that was spread intentionally to deceive. And as Rachel mentioned, we obviously know that misinformation is a threat. Just a figure that I like to put out there is that 96% of Canadians who use the internet to find information during the first few months of the pandemic saw COVID-19 misinformation. And that was a report from Statistics Canada. And as Rachel mentioned, we released a report today, Misinformation in Canada, Research and Policy Options. I'm not going to go through it in depth, but essentially we found that misinformation and disinformation are threats to our democratic institutions and the health and safety of the public. And as Rachel mentioned, differing political, media, legal, and cultural landscapes in Canada can shape the spread and impact of misinformation and disinformation. And we did notice that as we were researching this, that substantially more research is needed in the Canadian context. So we're going to jump straight ahead to how do we deal with it. Last time we talked about individual and a little bit about organizational efforts. And the important takeaway there was that things had to be proactive. You had to try and inoculate the individuals to prepare them for misinformation before they actually saw it. Efforts that happen afterwards, such as debunking, couldn't still be effective, but they were less effective than doing it before. And today we're going to be focusing on governmental actions, specifically the Canadian federal government. And how did I come to these recommendations or policy options? We essentially collated whatever we could find on the topic. This would be peer-reviewed literature, government reports and actions, both in Canada and internationally. This includes reports to standing committees, as well as white papers internationally, and like work that was already being done in other governments to address this, as well as any reports and recommendations from any working groups that we could find. And I tried to categorize them into three broad topics. So the first is actively criminalizing disinformation. So making it illegal to create and disseminate disinformation. The second is a very prominent topic, which is regulating online platforms, with most of the focus there being on regulating social media platforms. And the third thing we're going to talk about is funding literacy and research initiatives. So these three together were kind of the three most common things that we saw from the recommendations, and that's what I'm going to be focusing on today. So beginning with the first one, criminalizing disinformation. As I mentioned, it essentially refers to making it a crime to create or disseminate disinformation. So essentially adding it to our criminal code. Globally, this has been a common response to disinformation over the past few years, but this has also been a concern because there's worrying rises in these sorts of laws being used to crack down on dissent or also crack down on the freedom of the press. So this is the sort of context that you're coming into when you're trying to pass a law such as this. And generally recommendations discourage from any sort of government directed removal of content or any sort of broad criminalization. So Canada has already made some efforts to criminalize disinformation, and we're going to go over them, but it's important to understand the Canadian legal context. Any potential law has to align with the Charter of Rights. I'm just going to highlight two important aspects of the Charter of Rights, the first being Section 2B, specifically the freedom of expression. That's the one that mostly comes up. And then the second part is Section 1, where there is actually reasonable limits prescribed by law that are balancing out Section 2B. So essentially this becomes a decision for the courts, where they decide whether or not something can violate Section 2B, but actually meet Section 1 and therefore be allowed. And an important case that sort of defines the entire effort to criminalize disinformation is that spreading false information is allowed under the freedom of expression in our charter rights. This was shown in R.V. Zundel in 1992. And essentially it said that it is not allowed to be in the criminal code that you can be arrested for spreading false information intentionally. However, there are other parts of freedom of expression that there are currently restrictions on, such as hate speech, obscenity, paid advertisements, criminal harassment, defamatory libel, uttering threats, and intimidation. So Tenove et al. Argues that we could actually just use these existing criminal code and then apply them to online disinformation in a way that they haven't been done yet. Obviously, this would present difficulties because it's hard to prove that somebody knew something was false when they were sharing it, but it is a potential option. Also, there has been generally the Supreme Court of Canada allows criminalization or allows restrictions on freedom of expression when they're done in very specific circumstances. So they've done some regarding during election periods, that there are certain things that you can say and you can't say. So to focus on that, we're going to look at the 2018 Elections Modernization Act. So this was passed at the end of 2018 by the Liberal government, and it came into effect in early 2019. And essentially it had a couple things that were directly related to disinformation. The first of which was it created an offense for essentially impersonating a candidate, political party, or chief electoral officer, where the material was published with the intent of misleading the public into believing that it was authorized. So essentially, you can't impersonate an official to provide information that you think that you were trying to deceive the public with. So this law was in place for the 2019 election, and it was only used to remove 13 posts from the internet in the 2 months preceding the 2019 election. So this law was on the books, but it didn't really have a wide impact on what was going on during the election. The second part that we're going to be focusing on refers to this section. Essentially, we don't need to read this whole thing, but it became illegal to make false statements that any sort of political candidate or someone associated with a political party had committed an offense or is charged with or under investigation of offense. On top of that, any sort of false statements about place of birth, citizenship, education, membership in a group were also then legislated to be illegal. And this law was an update of a previous law that had existed since 2003, which was much shorter, that you couldn't, with the intention of affecting the results of election, knowingly make or publish any false statement of fact in relation to the personal character or conduct of a candidate or prospective candidate. So this law had actually been around in a form, and then it just got updated. However, one important thing happened. They took away the word knowingly. So as you notice in the bottom law, the word knowingly was taken away. And this was actually then a charter challenge was attempted and successful. So this law was struck down in early 2021. So it was in place for the 2019 election, but in early 2021, this law was struck down by the Ontario Supreme Court. And subsequently, the Trudeau government decided that they won't appeal the ruling. So that part of the law is now struck down. So we see two different laws, one which is still standing that refers to the impersonation, which is incredibly specific, and a second one which attempted to make an incredibly specific law, but due to the fact that it infringed on freedom of expression, was removed or struck down and no longer is valid. But it was in place for the 2019 election. However, it didn't even have that much of an impact. Most of the disinformation that people saw didn't fit into those very specific categories, sort of about citizenship and things like that, and instead were focused on other things. So this law, even though it was in effect, didn't actually have a large impact on the election. So where do we go from here? Criminalization of disinformation is definitely going to be an uphill battle, trying to make a law that adheres to a charter and also is effective in actually getting rid of disinformation on a widespread level. And also, even with this, these laws are focused on very, very specific incidents. So they would have to be part of a larger strategy anyways. So it becomes a thing of that it seems like the current Trudeau government has given up on trying to pass a law to this effect because of the difficulties and also due to the unpopularity and the fact that it probably won't survive a charter challenge or be that effective in the end anyways. So then we're going to move on to our second aspect, which is regulating online platforms. Online platforms such as social media are a prominent source of misinformation, but also we need to include search engines and messaging apps in this. So essentially any sort of digital platform that provides a service. That has been the focus of a lot of recommendations on how to get rid of misinformation and disinformation. And the problem with what currently is ongoing is that these online platforms have been self-regulating. They've been taking down misinformation or disinformation as they see fit. For example, prior to the 2019 election, there was a government-led declaration of integrity where social media platforms pledged to safeguard the election. The fact that it was non-binding meant it was voluntary. And we weren't really sure what the requirements are or what they did that was actually different. Again, most of the recommendations that we saw avoided suggesting government-led removal and content and instead focused on the transparency of how information is spread. And I collated these recommendations into 3 categories. The first being algorithms, the second being content moderation, and the third being dealing with micro-targeting in ads. And we're going to go through each one of them separately. The first thing is defining what an algorithm is. Essentially, algorithm is a part of the code where you help automate decisions. It takes in a variety of information and then it determines how that information is going to be propagated online. So when you type something into Google, how it is ranked is due to algorithms. Pretty much everything that you see on social media platforms has some sort of algorithm behind it. Algorithms aren't inherently bad, but since they aren't available to the public or to researchers, possibly due to commercial concerns, it becomes very difficult to know what they're actually doing and therefore difficult to stop misinformation from being transmitted on them. And just as an example, if you go into Google right now, you can see trending searches. Those are provided algorithmically. No one's entirely sure how that works. As you start typing, more algorithms begin to suggest things. And then when you finally type something in, even the results, how they are ranked, it's unclear to the public and unclear to researchers how that actually occurs. And this isn't just Google. You can also see when you go onto YouTube, if you're watching a previous great webinar, you can see that on the side, they begin to recommend other videos. And some of them, I guess, make sense, but some of them, I'm a little confused why they're there. So it just becomes a question of, we don't really know what's going on. And that's why we have to start legislating transparency so we can really figure it out. And most of the suggestions are around creating an independent agency or regulatory body which has the ability to audit social media algorithms, as well as mandatory transparency disclosures. And these transparency disclosures, oftentimes people recommend doing them at different levels. So some things have to be disclosed to the public at a level that the public can understand. For example, like how you're seeing certain posts, why things are being moderated a certain way. And then other things would be only for the auditor or someone like that to see, which is the full code. And the need for these audits is to see whether or not the algorithms are doing what they're saying they're doing, and to see if you can sort of regulate by any sort of code. On top of that, people have pushed for vetted researchers to audit algorithms. This would help with research going forward to understand how information is spreading around the internet and how you can possibly intervene to reduce misinformation. Of course, an independent agency would have to have some sort of teeth, and most of the time, people recommend doing sanctions or some sort of enforcement power for non-compliance. Other ideas that have come across of this, in conjunction with having sort of that transparency, is that any content that is produced algorithmically for the user is labeled as such, and then also with the information of why did they get shown this, just to help the public understand where information is coming from and to understand that it's not organic. Also on top of that, you could create some sort of standards for regulating algorithms, maybe a code that you'd have to go by, or defining any limits. How much should you be amplifying something that's unverified, for example, and best practices. And this would work in conjunction with the independent agency auditing it to see if what they're saying they're doing is in fact what the algorithm is doing. One other example that's quite popular is the creation and implementation of circuit breakers. Essentially, if something becomes algorithmically amplified at a very fast pace, but yet it's unverified, a circuit breaker would pause that sort of amplification until a human could come in, or a group of humans that work at the social media platform or whatever platform, to decide if it is verified or not before it gets amplified any further. So it's just sort of breaking up the system and changing what the social media platforms look like and how they work, to avoid it being about clicks, to avoid about being profiting off misinformation, and instead more about public safety and transparency. So how would this help? First off, the public, every time they saw any sort of information that they didn't specifically subscribe to that was shown to them by an algorithm, they would understand that it is that, and they would understand why they were being targeted with that information. It would also help provide regulators and researchers with an understanding of how algorithms operate, and this could be iteratively used to reduce misinformation spread by practicing different interventions. And then also there's the possibility of creating some sort of code, best practices to help standardize and regulate how algorithms are used. The second step in regulating potentially online platforms is content moderation. All online platforms have their own usage policies and moderations by which they are able to remove posts and accounts they've determined to have broken their terms of service, as is their right. I mean, no one's saying that's a bad thing, but what they are saying is that, again, there is a lack of transparency. It's largely private. There's no oversight from independent bodies. There's a lack of standardized regulation or codes from conduct from governing bodies, and there's also potential biases in moderation, lack of transparency in decisions, and also a lack of recourse for when post accounts are removed. Obviously, social media platforms vary widely. Some are more transparent with what they're showing and others aren't, but what we're looking for here is sort of like consistent across the board that would apply to existing online platforms, but any that would also pop up in the future. For example, a recent article that I found, Facebook removes 110,000 pieces of COVID misinformation posted by Australian users. This is a good headline, presumably, but we don't really understand what the process was behind the removing of these posts, whether they were done erroneously or not, over what time, how quickly were they getting to these posts after they were posted. All we see is just this one number. So essentially what is being proposed here is a type of meta regulation or meta moderation, where you instead provide oversight to the decisions made by the platform moderators. You don't do any content-led removal from the government themselves, but instead you just provide some sort of oversight for the people that are making the decisions. And all the sort of policy recommendations would guide moderation into a transparent fashion. This could include setting standards for consistent moderation across platforms, providing recourse for those who feel their profile or post was removed erroneously, and then also sort of having legislative processes for disclosing different moderation decisions, sort of some sort of database where you can go and look why posts were removed, what the process was. And some of these standards and codes of conduct would also define how fast or how quickly they have to respond to posts and things such as that. Another thing that has been proposed is some sort of national social media council. This is analogous to current broadcasting standards culture in Canada, to coordinate content moderation across social media platforms. Obviously, this would be still be somewhat self-regulation, so there are concerns about that. But this could be also a useful way to get the social media platforms on board to help them define those codes of conduct. So how would this help? Again, this would be standardize and regulate how moderation is used. It would increase transparency so public would understand why posts are being removed, what the process is, what type of fact checking is going on. And then obviously, once we understand how moderation is done, we can begin to research it and also refine efforts going forward. And the final thing we're going to focus on is micro-targeting in ads. Micro-targeting largely refers to the use of personal data to tailor content. This can include pretty much anything that you put online, demographic information, political leanings, products you purchase, your location. Essentially, this type of data is sold to different marketers to target their ad campaigns, political campaigns, and is used internally to also help with recommendations. And it does help target misinformation to groups that may be susceptible to it. It also leads to sort of homophily, where you're beginning to only see things that are related to things that you saw before. And again, there's a lack of transparency on how this works. So you're beginning to see a theme, I hope. So some of the solutions here is that you have to require labeling of paid advertisements online. I know some social media platforms already are doing this, but again, this is about consistently applying laws across all platforms. Require an explanation of why the content was targeted to you and what information was used to come to that decision, including options that you can opt out for further use. And the final thing would be to actually legislate to limit the ability of advertisers and other groups to use personal information to micro-target their ads. And a part of the Elections Act of 2018, the Modernization Act that I mentioned earlier, is that for the 2019 election, the online platforms actually had to publish a digital registry of partisan and election advertising messages. So anything that reached a certain threshold of monthly internet users on a platform, they would have to put into a database to explain who bought the ad and as well as what ad it was. as this was done prior to the 2019 election, I know some of the social media platforms such as Facebook did create something like this. Some of the other websites decided to just not show any sort of political ads as a result of this. But if there is an election going forward, this law is actually still in place. So it would be interesting to see how that turns out. So essentially, if we're going to do an overview of how to regulate online platforms, there are a lot of available options even beyond what I said. But these are the general sort of themes that we're looking at, is that transparency, that oversight, and the ability to somewhat regulate without actually doing any government-led content removal, and instead be focusing on the activities of the platforms themselves and the online platforms themselves and their moderators. However, as we know, online sources are not the only sources of misinformation, although they are a relatively prominent one. So the last thing we're going to focus on, the last big section, is different types of literacy initiatives. Essentially, literacy initiatives have to be part of long-term efforts to build resilience in communities against misinformation. And the policy option here directly would be to have continued government funding for initiatives to improve literacy. This is in addition to previously, since January 2020, the federal government has spent $7.2 million to address online misinformation and disinformation. So that is an effort that we commend and we are actually funded by, but we are saying that future policy options should include larger funding for these types of initiatives, especially going forward. And I'm quickly just going to explain why this is important. As I mentioned before, when we looked through the literature and we looked at the individual efforts in the last webinar, addressing misinformation is more effective proactively and also should more effective when you talk about the techniques that were used to deceive. Essentially, why was this able to deceive you? And this helps you inoculate for future misinformation. So by increasing the resilience against misinformation, you can sort of proactively inoculate against it. And that's what literacy efforts do. They teach you about information and how to access it and how to critically think. And then going forward, you'll be less susceptible to the misinformation itself. And I'm just going to define what I mean by literacy. There's a lot of different types of literacy. The prominent one and sort of the umbrella term that I'm referring to is information literacy. And that for me, or for the definition that I found, is essentially the ability to locate, evaluate, and use effectively the needed information. So to understand and critically evaluate information as it comes in so that you're not fooled by misinformation and you're less susceptible to it. Obviously, there can be breakdowns into different categories. One prominent one is digital literacy. This is just information literacy in an online space. So if you have the ability to locate, evaluate, and use effectively information found online. Media literacy, this is the ability to access and also critically evaluate anything you see in the media. That can be online media, social media, anything you see on YouTube type thing, anything you see on television. Another one that I think is actually very important, especially in the recent COVID pandemic or the ongoing COVID pandemic, is the science literacy, sort of the increasing the understanding of basic key scientific concepts and processes, and to use this knowledge to make more informed personal decisions and to better engage with society. And functionally what that means is to understand how research is done, how the scientific method, what good research looks like, what bad research looks like, how to evaluate research that you see reported on in the media, essentially just building resilience so that when, if a new crisis occurs and it's scientific related, you're able to critically evaluate the information that's coming to you. And the final one here is sort of a part of science literacy, I guess, but it's under the umbrella of information literacy, and that's health literacy. And that's the ability to find, understand, and use information and services to inform health-related decisions. All of these have a similar goal, and that is just to increase your understanding of how to find information and how to critically evaluate it. And doing that will proactively inoculate you for misinformation. Obviously, these initiatives already exist. Universities, colleges, libraries, schools, community centers, and other organizations. What we are suggesting is that one of the policy options is to expand these types of programs and also to create new initiatives. Especially when we looked at the report, we saw that there is local influences on how misinformation spreads, provincial, national. So it's important to get as many initiatives going for all the different types of literacies to reach different communities and cover all the types of literacies to reach different communities. And essentially, this will help inoculate for misinformation that isn't only online. This can be for all misinformation or disinformation that comes across somebody's plate, because you're never fully going to be able to stop someone from hearing misinformation, although we will be able to substantially reduce it, hopefully, from some of these policy options. But it's also important that if someone does hear it, that they're able to evaluate it and not be susceptible to it. And the final thing is research initiatives. As we mentioned, our report found that substantial more research is needed in the Canadian context on misinformation. There was research on it. Sometimes it lacked cohesion in that there were just a few studies on each topic, and there wasn't like an ongoing substantial base of evidence for one topic in misinformation. And we definitely saw that there was a lot of local and provincial and community level influences. In addition to that, information ecosystem is complex and it's unique and distinct in Canada. So we need to understand how people in Canada get their information, and also research is useful for evaluating the progress of these other programs. How can we know something is working unless we're doing the research to understand what is working and what isn't working? One example that I found that was a sort of a useful analogy for what potentially could be an option going forward is to help build a substantial body of research on misinformation. You could have specific collaborative research projects. And obviously the policy for the government here is to fund these sort of research projects. I know some of them are ongoing, but increased funding or substantial continued funding for these research initiatives would be helpful. And I just wanted to point out the Digital Ecosystem Research Challenge that was done in the lead up to the 2019 federal election and was funded by the government. Essentially what had happened in this research challenge was that they held an open competition to select research projects to study the 2019 election. They found 18 projects, and then working together, they provided them with data such as survey data. And then at the end, they released a report, they did a symposium, they gave their results to policymakers. And the interesting thing was that these 18 projects were actually quite, covered a lot of different research questions at the community level and at the national level. But they were drawn together by one single cohesion, which was that they were all related to the 2019 election. So future initiatives like this that provide funding for Canadian specific misinformation research could do something similar to this. And I just wanted to point that out as a potential option. So I guess I've gone a little quickly, but essentially not one policy is going to solve this issue all by itself. And that there are several paths going forward. From the recommendations that we saw those three categories, the first of which was criminalization of disinformation, which might not work out in the Canadian context. The second is the regulation of online platforms. And the final was sort of the funding for research and literacy initiatives. And in conjunction with the individual and organizational efforts that we provided in the previous webinar, the impact and spread of misinformation hopefully can be reduced. Thank you all for tuning in, and I'll now take any questions. Thanks.
I'm on mute. Hi, Tej. Thank you so much for that fantastic presentation. Wow, there's really a lot to think about. And I see some questions here, but just before I get into those, I know that, you know, as we've talked about this work over the last couple months, you know, you've often mentioned how overwhelming this topic has been, just the scale and the scope of the problem and the challenges here. Just wondering if you can speak to, like, you know, after a year of being immersed in this topic, are you optimistic? Are you like, is there, you know, we've talked about kind of the individual versus organization versus government approach. Is there, you know, is there a particular area where you think that, you know, we should, E4D can focus on going forward, or I don't know, just anything kind of to speak to that, like the scale of the issue and kind of how you're feeling coming out of this work?
Yeah, so it's a relatively large issue, and it's very hard to sort of wrap your head around the different things. Like any sort of big issue, it's very hard to wrap your head around all the pieces that need to come together to make it happen. And I guess the way I've compartmentalized it is that I think it's going to be a series of smaller actions as opposed to like one big law that changes everything. And it is sort of in that collective effort that potentially issues can be. And we've seen progress, I think, maybe I'm just being optimistic, in certain areas around elections and things like that, where we've seen that social media platforms have done some things. And I think beginning to move in the right direction. And the fact that all these recommendations were out there, we're not the only people thinking about this. For Dee's perspective, I thought it was interesting that there was that sort of, I don't want to say lack of Canadian specific research, but definitely not a sustained substantial body of research. A lot of people did a lot of research, but they were very isolated and there was no sort of that cohesion. And I think if we're going to tackle the issue, sometimes things that are true in America, or that is where a lot of the research is done, aren't necessarily true in Canada.
Right.
They might be, but you need to test out those types of things. So I think just pushing for sort of, which is things we have pushed before, but just increasing sort of sustained research funding for a specific issue in a Canadian context, I think could be really important and also could help going forward.
That's a really helpful perspective. Thanks. Okay, so I've opened up the chat here and people have been dropping in some questions. I'm gonna go to the beginning. So we have a question here from Galen. Self-regulated social media companies use algorithms to impersonate real people. For example, our specialized team has determined your report was invalid. Can companies be regulated to be disallowed to impersonate real humans?
So I guess we're referring to the companies themselves. Important, yeah.
I believe.
I guess that could be part of sort of the code of conduct that you have for moderation, if that's something that the politicians decide to add in.
Right.
What I first thought when I read that was specifically around bots, which is another issue, which there are also sort of recommendations for that I didn't include. But essentially, there's anti-spam laws that are generally used for telephone and things like that. But there were suggestions that those types of anti-spam laws could also be applied to the internet to sort of reduce the amount of bots and things like that. I don't know if I fully answered that question, but yeah, I think if it was something that people were interested in, that is something that could be included in sort of the code of conduct.
Right. Now a question from Colin. How does the category of mischief tie into misinformation/disinformation within Canada and its laws? And does this differ from the situation in the US and in Europe?
Yeah, so mischief, I believe, is a part of the criminal code. And much like the other things that I listed with like harassment and things like that, it is theoretically possible that they were applied to sort of misinformation, disinformation, and online. I don't know if they specifically have, and I don't know how specifically popular that would be. But since it is on the books, I think Tenove et al. Was that one paper that argued that we already have some of these laws. Maybe we just start applying them in a consistent sense. I'm not going to comment on whether I think that's a good or bad idea, but I think that that would be one of the laws that's included in there. And how does it differ from the situation in USA? USA has a different constitution, and I'm not going to pretend like I fully understand everything that happens there, and I also don't understand it in Europe. But I think that our unique legal context means that there's different legal pathways for us to do something than there is there. But yeah, I can't go any further than that, sorry.
A question from Charles. An important question is what actually construes misinformation? So many people will follow the science on one topic and not the other, but think that they are.
Yeah, so essentially that's kind of the big thing is that right now the social media platforms themselves are deciding what is misinformation, and we don't really know what they're doing. That's part of the thing with the meta regulation and moderation is that understanding like what they decided was misinformation, what it wasn't, and providing recourse for it. This isn't necessarily somewhere where the government should step in and be like, this is misinformation, that is misinformation. Each platform has their own terms of service that they're using. It's just more clarity around what they decide is misinformation, because it doesn't specifically matter what I think is misinformation, it's the people that are deciding. And then to provide some sort of way of having recourse and to update those laws or code that they're using to not have the same problem in the future if it turns out something doesn't end up being misinformation. So the first step is we don't actually know what's happening. So once we figure out what's happening, the second step is to actually come up with what's going to work for different people. And then that would also involve consultations and things like that. But sort of a multi-step process where right now I can't even comment because I don't even know, like that 100,000 misinformation post that I put up there. I don't know what was in there. I don't know how they came to those conclusions.
Right. All right, moving along here. Ooh, we're just firing these questions here into the chat. Given that social media algorithm design is known to have used scientific psychological insights to influence users, and that some insights indicate that in the absence of psychologically informed framing, measures that correct misinformation are ineffective. What role should psychology play in literacy campaigns?
Yeah, so I see that they also reference Pennycook. Yes, so, in the previous webinar, we went over a lot of Pennycook's work. Essentially, so he had that one paper which showed the 3 ways that people were susceptible to misinformation, one of which was information deficit, the other one was motivated reasoning, and the third was lazy analytical thinking. And that sort of is where he's going with his recent research, is that like nudging people to think about accuracy will actually make them better at seeing whether or not a fake news headline is a real news headline, or identifying misinformation. And as we saw last time, is that debunking is less effective than inoculating. And there are certain papers that point to different ways of doing that with humor and things like that. So it is an important part of like psychologically informing your decisions, your policies is an important part of, and that's sort of more on the individual and organizational level, where it's like there's different techniques that work and there's different techniques that don't. And it's important to understand which are which. And that is a part of literacy, is understanding sort of what is misinformation, how it tries to trick you, why you should always be thinking, sort of being nudging about accuracy. So I don't think anything we said here is incongruent with incorporating that. And I do think it's an important part. And it was an important part of sort of the inoculation method that we've previously presented.
Right, right.
I hope that makes sense.
We need some behavioral scientists on the case. Moving on here, a message from Barry, a question. To what extent can the advertising industry itself help or be regulated to address this challenge?
I mean, yeah, so essentially the advertising industry is just taking the options that are available to them. Google provides them, or Facebook provides them with, you can target it to these people. So their end, they could choose, I guess, not to micro-target. But I don't know how much, like if you're presented with an option, you think it's okay, you might go ahead with it. So I think it's one of those things that they make profit off of doing these things because they are more effective. So I don't know if regulating the ad industry themselves would help, but I think having sort of laws of what you can actually use to micro-target someone or to limit that would be helpful. And that would impact the advertising industry. Right. Or if they want to take it upon themselves to decide not to use micro-targeting, that would also be nice. But I'm not super hopeful.
Another question from a different Barry this time. There are 2 Barrys on the webinar. What are the odds? There's Barry with an IE and Barry with a Y. Shout out to the Barrys on the call, on the webinar. Would this conversation be made easier if the internet was considered more of a public utility? For example, would it be easier to regulate if it was closer to something like hydro or energy?
Yeah, and that is kind of where the discussion seems to be going, is that these should be regulated because they are sort of public spaces, and that you're not able to make the argument anymore that they are just private spaces because of the amount of people that are on social media and like how often do you go Google something and just how it is a part of everyday life. I don't know if there's, sorry, the question moved. I don't know if there's like a specific thing that needs to be said to make public utility legally, but I think that like that is the framework that people are starting to work through. I guess public utilities also are like owned by the government, which isn't where most of these recommendations go. So I wouldn't say that they're going that far with it, but I think that we're sort of going into the idea that it's a public space, even though it is on a private platform.
Okay, another question or invitation for comment on your thoughts, please, on healthy skepticism from scientific literacy as an antidote to misinformation.
I don't, assuming that healthy skepticism is just like critically evaluating sort of everything that you see and not just believing something because it like fits in with your previous beliefs. I think that is a big part of scientific literacy. And essentially, if we are critically evaluating all the information that we see all the time, which is sort of in line with what Pennycook was doing with nudging, I think that'll help with us not being susceptible to misinformation. Obviously, that's very difficult because we get functionally bombarded with misinformation or information in general. So it becomes kind of overwhelming and there is sort of that mental load. But I think that is sort of the core tenet of all of the information literacy and scientific literacy is that having sort of a skeptical view of whether or not this is true or not, and to actually go investigate from the primary sources. I think we mentioned that in the last webinar, but it's just like go as far as you can, read as many different sources as you can, check out source credibility, see if everyone's saying the same thing if you don't fully understand the primary literature itself, and then just have that sort of skepticism there.
Right. Right. Moving on, we have the $1 million question here from Lara. She says, thanks so much for doing this research. Bill C-10 has been a contentious piece of legislation in Parliament as of late. And what I was wondering if it had any implications for curtailing misinformation.
Yeah, so Bill C-10, I originally was going to put it in this presentation, but they're not framing it as something that'll have any effect on disinformation and misinformation. It seems like from everything I read that they are framing it as, and so this is a proposed bill where essentially they're trying to give the CRTC some sort of jurisdiction over content that is published online. The controversy there is that critics say that the law is allowing for the government to essentially take off user-generated content, that the law is broad enough that it's not just focused on things like Netflix. It's now dealing with YouTube and things like that. So I guess like inadvertently, it might curtail disinformation, but I'm not entirely sure that if the critics are right, that the cost would be worth it. And I can understand why it's contentious. I originally thought that they were doing it as a disinformation thing, but it doesn't seem like that's in any of the literature. It seems more about protecting Canadian content and sort of that discussion with the CRTC. And there's a reason why the proposal, the National Social Media Council or whatever, is analogous to something like the CRTC in that it isn't the same thing. Because you need to have some sort of input from the people that are actually being impacted, such as Netflix and YouTube and them. I hope that they don't go through with it in the form that the critics say it is in right now. There isn't that sort of option for the government, because all the recommendations have said that government-led removal of content is not the way to go, because that's kind of a slippery slope. So yeah, Bill C-10 is interesting and something I'm keeping an eye on, but I just couldn't see how it directly related to disinformation in this context.
All right. I think that answers most of the questions and comments we've received. Just double checking. Do you have any closing remarks, closing words for us, Tej, before we sign off?
Thanks for coming. Hopefully you enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you everyone for coming. And like I said, we've had really great interest from our community in these webinars and on this topic specifically. So we really appreciate your interest in the topic, and certainly stay tuned for more on this topic potentially in the future. But in the meantime, please check out the full report. It's an excellent piece of work, and we look forward to continuing this work. As a slight aside, I feel like I've mentioned this to the Evidence for Democracy team already a few times, and I'll just mention it here, is that in the winter, there's a really, really excellent CBC Ideas podcast that came out. The speaker is Frédéric Bouchard from the University of Montreal, and he gave a really excellent lecture. It's called Science and Society, but it touches a lot on misinformation and the algorithms and kind of the broader implications for what these things are doing to the role of experts in society. So if you're interested in this topic, I encourage you to look up that podcast and give it a listen. It's fantastic. But yeah, thank you again for attending. Thank you, Tej, for this presentation today and for really leading all this work here at E4D. And thanks one more time to the Government of Canada for supporting this work. And that's it. So thanks, everybody.